The cabin stood at the edge of a serene forest, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the cool breeze. Ethan and Zara stepped out of their old SUV, taking in the stillness that stretched around them like a comforting embrace. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light on the weathered wooden structure that would be their refuge for the next several months. Behind them, their 6 dogs bounded out of the car, tails wagging and paws crunching on the gravel driveway, as if sensing the adventure awaiting them. Ethan stretched, his broad shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like weeks. "This is it," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "No emails, no deadlines, no noise." Zara smiled softly, brushing her dark hair out of her face as she looked up at the cabin. "It's perfect," she murmured, her green eyes shimmering with a mix of anticipation and nostalgia. "I've missed this kind of quiet." The dogs wasted no time exploring their new domain. Scout, the fearless border collie, darted toward the edge of the woods, sniffing the air as if tracking something unseen. Luna, the gentle golden retriever, padded toward the porch, her nose pressed to the old wooden boards. Diesel, the rambunctious shepherd mix, let out an excited bark, rallying the others into a frenzied game of chase. Ethan grabbed their bags from the trunk and glanced at Zara. "It's been a while since we've been this. Disconnected," he said, his tone light but laced with something deeper. "Think we can handle it?" Zara tilted her head, her smile softening as she stepped closer to him. "We'll be fine. We could use the time to reset, just us and the dogs." He nodded, her words settling something restless inside him. Together, they carried their bags inside, the dogs trailing after them like a protective pack. The interior of the cabin was simple but inviting. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth lined with neatly stacked logs. A well-worn sofa faced a large window overlooking the forest, and the scent of aged wood lingered in the air. It felt like stepping into another world, one far removed from the chaos of city life. As they unpacked, the dogs claimed their spots around the cabin. Scout curled up near the fireplace, her black and white coat blending with the shadows. Luna settled by Zara's feet, her golden fur catching the light as she rested her head on her paws. Diesel sprawled on the rug, his tail thumping against the floor in a steady rhythm. "Looks like they're making themselves at home," Ethan said with a grin, glancing at Zara as she placed a stack of books on the coffee table. "Smart dogs," she replied, her voice warm. "They know a good thing when they see it." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan lit the fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm glow across the cabin. Zara brewed tea in the small kitchen, the familiar ritual calming her as she listened to the soft sounds of the dogs breathing and the fire popping. When she returned to the living room, she found Ethan sitting on the sofa, staring out the window at the forest now bathed in moonlight. "Penny for your thoughts," she asked, handing him a steaming mug. He took it with a grateful smile, his fingers brushing hers. "Just thinking how quiet it is out here," he said. "It's a good kind of quiet, though, like the world's finally stopped spinning so fast." Zara settled beside him, her legs tucked under her as she sipped her tea. "I know what you mean," she said. "It's like this place has its own rhythm. I think we needed this more than we realized." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. The firelight danced in her eyes, and for a moment he felt the weight of the past few months lift. The stress, the arguments, the sleepless nights, they all seemed distant here, as if the cabin itself was helping to heal wounds they hadn't even acknowledged. The dogs began to stir as the night deepened. Scout lifted her head, her ears perking at a sound Ethan couldn't hear. Luna let out a soft whine, shifting closer to Zara as if seeking comfort. Even Diesel, usually unshakable, glanced toward the window with a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What's gotten into them?" Zara asked, her brow furrowing as she reached down to stroke Luna's fur. Ethan shrugged, though he couldn't shake the slight unease creeping up his spine. "Probably just getting used to the new place," he said, trying to sound casual. "It's a lot for them to adjust to." But as the night wore on, the strange behavior continued. Scout paced near the door, her nose pressed to the gap between the wood and the floor. Diesel let out a short, sharp bark every time the wind rattled the windows. Zara tried to soothe them, her voice soft as she murmured reassurances, but even she seemed on edge. When they finally went to bed, the dogs insisted on staying close. Luna curled up at Zara's feet, while Scout and Diesel took positions near the door as if standing guard. Ethan lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling as the faint sounds of the forest seeped through the walls. He told himself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, that the dogs were picking up on normal forest noises. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was watching. The first vision came that night. Ethan woke with a start, his heart racing as the remnants of a dream clung to his mind like cobwebs. He was in a dark forest, the trees looming overhead as a strange light flickered through the branches. He could hear voices, soft, urgent whispers, but he couldn't make out the words. When he turned, he saw Zara standing beside him, her face illuminated by the ethereal glow. She looked different. Her hair was longer, her clothes unfamiliar, but her eyes were the same, filled with a mixture of love and fear. Before he could speak, the vision shattered, and he was back in the cabin, the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Beside him, Zara stirred, her brow furrowing as if she, too, had been pulled from a restless dream. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded slowly, though her expression was troubled. "I think so. I had the strangest dream." Ethan's chest tightened. "What kind of dream?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the window. "I was in a forest," she said finally. "But it wasn't this one. It felt ancient somehow. And you were there." He sat up, his pulse quickening. "I saw the same thing." Zara's eyes widened, her hand tightening around his. "How is that possible?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But I don't think it's a coincidence." The dogs began to stir again, their movements slow but purposeful. Scout padded to the window, her ears perked as she stared into the forest. Diesel let out a soft huff, his tail swishing against the floor. It was as if they knew something Ethan and Zara didn't, something that lingered just beyond the edges of comprehension. For the first time, Ethan and Zara realized that the peace they had sought in this cabin came with a mystery, a connection to something larger, something that defied logic and time. They didn't understand it yet, but as they looked at each other, their hands entwined and their dogs gathered around them, they felt an unspoken certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the cabin as Ethan and Zara sat together on the worn sofa. Their 6 dogs were scattered around the room, a warm, living presence that filled the space with comfort. But despite the serene scene, Ethan could feel the tension in the air. He glanced at Zara, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames, her expression distant and thoughtful. He knew she was trying to make sense of what they had both experienced the night before, the strange dreams, the shared visions that felt more like memories than mere imagination. "I can't stop thinking about it," Zara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to look at him, her green eyes filled with a mix of wonder and unease. "It felt so real, Ethan. Like it was something I'd lived before." Ethan nodded slowly, his own thoughts a tangled mess. "I know what you mean. It wasn't just a dream. It was too vivid, too familiar." Zara shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "But how could that be possible? We've never been in a place like that. We've never..." She stopped, her breath hitching. "Do you think it means something?" Ethan didn't have an answer. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair as he tried to piece together the fragments of the vision. He remembered the towering forest, the strange glow, and Zara standing beside him in clothes that didn't belong to this time. He remembered the sound of whispers, words he couldn't quite make out, but that filled him with a deep, aching sense of longing. As if sensing his turmoil, Scout, the border collie, padded over and rested her head on Ethan's knee. He reached down to scratch behind her ears, her steady presence grounding him. "I don't know what it means," he admitted, "but I think we need to figure it out." Over the next few days, the visions grew stronger. They came in flashes during the day, moments where the world around them seemed to blur, and suddenly Ethan would find himself standing on a battlefield, the metallic scent of blood in the air, Zara's voice calling his name as chaos erupted around them. Other times they came at night, pulling them both into vivid dreams that felt like portals into other lives. In one dream, Ethan was a blacksmith in a medieval village, his hands calloused from years of forging steel. Zara was a healer, her touch gentle but firm as she bandaged the wounded. He remembered the way she smiled at him, the way her laugh filled the tiny workshop with light even as war loomed on the horizon. In another vision, Zara stood atop a windswept dune, her long hair tangled in the desert wind. She wore a flowing robe of deep crimson, her hands clutching a small, intricately carved talisman. Ethan was a soldier, his armor battered and dust-covered as he approached her. Their eyes met, and though neither of them spoke, the weight of their connection was undeniable. "What do you think it means?" Zara asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the forest alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. She had a journal open on her lap, its pages filled with hastily scribbled notes about the visions. Ethan shook his head, staring out at the darkened woods. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But every time I see those memories, those lives, it's always us. It's always you and me, no matter the time or place." Zara's hand tightened around her pen, her brow furrowed in thought. "Do you think we've been here before? In other lives?" Ethan turned to her, his chest tightening at the vulnerability in her voice. Maybe he said softly, "It feels like we're connected somehow. Like we've always been connected." Their dogs, who had been lounging nearby, suddenly perked up. Luna, the golden retriever, let out a soft whine, her ears swiveling toward the edge of the forest. Diesel, the shepherd mix, stood and barked once, a low, warning sound. Ethan and Zara exchanged a glance, their unease growing as the dog's behavior grew more erratic. The first time the visions bled into reality, Ethan was chopping firewood behind the cabin. The rhythmic sound of the axe splitting logs was comforting, grounding him in the present. But then the world shifted. The forest seemed to grow darker, the air heavier, and when he looked up, he was no longer in the cabin's yard. He stood in the middle of a ruined battlefield, the sky above him a sickly gray. Smoke rose from the remains of a distant village, and the ground beneath his feet was littered with broken weapons and torn banners. He felt the weight of a sword in his hand and the sting of a fresh wound on his arm. But it wasn't the carnage that caught his attention, it was Zara. She was kneeling a few feet away, her hands pressed against the chest of a young soldier as she tried desperately to stop the bleeding. Her hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and her face was etched with determination. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "we can't stay here. They're coming." Before he could respond, the vision shattered, and he was back in the yard, the axe still clutched in his hands. He sank to his knees, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he tried to process what had just happened. When he told Zara about it later, her expression was both worried and understanding. "It's like the past is bleeding through," she said, "like it's trying to tell us something." That night, they had their most vivid shared vision yet. They were standing on a cliff overlooking a vast, stormy sea. Ethan wore a long cloak that billowed in the wind, and Zara's hands were wrapped around a small, glowing orb that pulsed with light. The waves crashed against the rocks below, the sound deafening as the storm raged around them. "You have to let me go," Zara said, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she held the orb out to him. "It's the only way." "I can't," Ethan said, his voice raw. "I won't. If you don't, everything will be lost," she said, stepping closer. "Please, Ethan, trust me." The pain in her eyes was unbearable, and though every fiber of his being screamed at him to hold on, he knew she was right. With trembling hands, he reached for the orb, his fingers brushing hers as the light grew brighter. The moment their hands touched, the vision dissolved, and they both woke with a start, their breathing ragged. Zara clutched at the blanket, her eyes wide with fear and understanding. "We've been here before," she said, her voice trembling. "We've lived these lives, made these choices, and no matter what, we always find each other." Ethan reached for her, his hand closing over hers. "And we always will," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "No matter what, Zara, I promise." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the dogs settled back into uneasy sleep, Ethan and Zara held each other close, the weight of their shared past pressing down on them. They didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: their bond was timeless, unbroken by the cycles of life and death. Whatever the visions were leading them toward, they would face it together. They always had, and they always would. The cabin was never truly silent. Even in the dead of night, there was always the sound of paws against the wooden floor, soft breathing, or the occasional thump of a tail. Ethan and Zara's 6 dogs had always been more than pets, they were family, each with their distinct personalities and quirks that brought life to the quiet woods. But as the days passed and the strange visions intensified, Ethan began to notice something odd about their behavior. It wasn't just their alertness or the way they seemed to anticipate things before they happened. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. The first real hint came one evening when Zara was outside gathering firewood. Diesel, the shepherd mix, had been lying lazily by the hearth, his eyes half closed. But as soon as Zara stepped outside, he was on his feet, his ears perked and his body tense. Ethan watched as Diesel pressed his nose to the door, letting out a low, almost mournful whine. "She's fine," Ethan said, glancing at the dog, "just grabbing wood." But Diesel didn't settle. He paced by the door, his tail low, his gaze darting toward the windows as though sensing something Ethan couldn't. It wasn't until Zara returned, her cheeks flushed from the cold, that Diesel finally relaxed. He padded over to her, pressing his head against her leg in a way that felt more like reassurance than a greeting. "You're acting weird," Zara said, scratching behind his ears. "What's gotten into you?" Ethan shrugged, watching the scene with quiet curiosity. "Maybe he knows something we don't." Zara looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Or maybe he remembers something we don't." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should have been. Ethan didn't press, but later that night, As they sat by the fire with the dogs spread out around them, he found himself watching them more closely. Scout, the border collie, was curled up near Zara's feet, her head resting on her paws but her eyes wide open, scanning the room with an intensity that made Ethan uneasy. Luna, the golden retriever, was pressed against Zara's side, her soft whines barely audible but insistent. Even Rocky, the usually aloof husky, stayed close, his ears twitching at every small sound. "They're protecting us," Zara said softly, her hand absently stroking Luna's fur. Ethan frowned. "From what?" Zara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I don't think it's from something here. I think it's from the past." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to make sense of it all. The visions, the strange sense of déjà vu, the dog's behavior, it all felt connected, but the threads were too tangled to unravel. The connection became clearer the next day. Zara had been sorting through old books left in the cabin by previous owners when she came across a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with faded handwriting, describing life in the cabin decades earlier. But what caught her attention was a single entry near the middle, one that described the presence of 6 dogs, each with distinct markings and personalities that mirrored their own pack. The writer had called them guardians, protectors of something sacred that transcended time. Zara read the entry aloud to Ethan, her voice trembling. "They are not merely dogs," she read. "They are watchers, bound to us in ways we cannot fully understand. Their loyalty is eternal, their presence a reminder of what we have lost and what we must preserve." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he listened. "It's like they've always been with us," he said quietly. "Not just in this life, but in all the ones before." Zara nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal. "That's what it feels like. Like they're more than companions, like they're part of us." That night, Ethan had another vision. He was standing in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, their branches heavy with moss. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and he could hear the distant howl of wolves. When he turned, he saw Zara kneeling beside a fire, her hands moving over a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Their 6 dogs stood in a circle around her, their forms blurred and shimmering as though they were caught between worlds. "They're coming," Zara said, her voice urgent but steady. "We have to protect it." "What is it?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. She looked up at him, her green eyes glowing in the firelight. "Our bond. Our thread. If they break it, we'll lose everything." Before he could respond, the vision shattered, and he woke with a start. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Zara was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. But the dogs were awake. All of them. Scout sat near the door, her ears perked and her gaze fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. Diesel was pacing, his movements restless and agitated. Luna whined softly, pressing against Zara, as if to shield her from some unseen threat. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. None of the dogs responded, but their behavior made it clear that something was happening, something Ethan couldn't begin to understand. He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, but there was a heaviness to the air, a feeling that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "They know," Zara said softly, startling him. He turned to see her sitting up, her eyes wide and alert. "They can feel it." "Feel what?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. She shook her head, her hand resting on Luna's back. "The past. The weight of everything we've been through. They're trying to keep us safe." Ethan sank back onto the sofa, his mind racing. He thought of the journal, of the visions, of the strange, unshakable bond they had always felt with their dogs. It wasn't just love or loyalty, it was something older, something woven into the fabric of their existence. Over the following days, the dogs became even more attuned to the energy around them. Scout began leading them on walks through the forest, always taking the same winding path that seemed to have no destination. Diesel and Luna stayed close to Zara, their movements almost synchronized as they shadowed her every step. Even Rocky, who usually wandered off on his own, began to linger near Ethan, his sharp blue eyes watchful and alert. One afternoon, as they followed Scout's lead through the woods, they stumbled upon a clearing Ethan had never seen before. In the center was a large stone, its surface etched with symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. The dogs surrounded it, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on the stone as if it held the answers to every question Ethan and Zara had been asking. "What is this?" Zara whispered, her hand brushing against the rough surface of the stone. Ethan didn't know, but as he looked at the dogs, at Scout's steady gaze, at Diesel's quiet strength, At Luna's unwavering loyalty, he felt a surge of understanding. They weren't just guardians of the past. They were the bridge between what had been and what could be, the protectors of a bond that had endured through countless lives. "They've always been with us," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. "In every life, in every world. They've been guiding us, keeping us together." Zara turned to him, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Then we can't let them down," she said. "We have to honor what they've been protecting." Ethan nodded, his hand finding hers as they stood together in the clearing, their dogs gathered around them. The past, the present, and the future felt like one, woven together by a thread that was unbreakable. And for the first time, Ethan and Zara understood that their love was more than just a connection between two people. It was a legacy, a promise, and a testament to the power of devotion that transcended time itself. The fire in the cabin burned low, casting long shadows on the wooden walls as the wind howled outside. Ethan and Zara sat together on the floor near the hearth, their backs against the sofa. The warmth of the flames did little to ease the chill that had settled in their hearts after the events of the past few days. The visions had grown more intense, their clarity almost unbearable. Every dream, every shared fragment of memory, brought them closer to understanding the truth of their connection and the sacrifices that had defined it across lifetimes. Ethan stared at the fire, his hands resting on his knees. The dogs were scattered around the room, their usual lively energy replaced with an eerie stillness. Scout lay near the door, her ears twitching at every gust of wind, while Diesel rested his head on Zara's lap, his eyes half open but watchful. It was as if they, too, felt the weight of what was coming. "I saw you," Zara said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the tremor beneath it. "In my dream last night. You were a knight, standing on a battlefield. You were hurt, bleeding, but you wouldn't leave." Ethan turned to her, his chest tightening at the sight of her pale face and shadowed eyes. "What happened?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing through Diesel's fur as if seeking comfort. "You stayed behind to hold the line. You told me to run, to save myself. But I didn't want to leave you. I begged you to come with me, but you said you couldn't. That it was the only way to keep me safe." His throat tightened, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. "Did I make it?" he asked quietly, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Her eyes glistened, and she shook her head. "No," she whispered, "you didn't." The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He had seen glimpses of that life before, moments of battle, of desperation, but never the end. Hearing it from Zara, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it feel all too real. "I've seen it too," he admitted, his voice rough. "Different lives, different worlds, but it's always the same. One of us has to make the choice. One of us has to lose the other." Zara's hand tightened in Diesel's fur, her shoulders trembling. "Why does it keep happening, Ethan? Why are we always forced to sacrifice everything just to be together?" "I don't know," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "But I'm tired of it. I'm tired of losing you." She looked at him then, her green eyes fierce despite the tears pooling in them. "Then maybe this time we don't let it happen. Maybe this time we fight back." Ethan's jaw clenched, his heart pounding at the determination in her voice. "How? How do we fight something that's been happening for lifetimes? It's like the universe is trying to keep us apart." "Then we make the universe listen," she said, her voice firm. "We break the cycle." Their conversation was interrupted by a low growl from Scout. The border collie stood near the door, her body tense, her gaze fixed on something outside. Luna joined her, letting out a soft whine as her tail tucked between her legs. Diesel lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the window as the air in the room seemed to thicken. Ethan stood, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Zara followed his gaze, her hand instinctively reaching for his. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. It was the same feeling he'd had in the visions, an ominous weight, as if something unseen was watching them. Before either of them could speak, the window nearest the fireplace rattled violently. The dogs barked in unison, their growls low and menacing as they formed a protective circle around Ethan and Zara. The wind outside seemed to roar louder, the trees swaying wildly as the cabin creaked under the strain. Ethan grabbed the fireplace poker, his knuckles white as he held it like a weapon. "Stay close," he said, his voice tight. Zara didn't argue. She crouched near Luna, her hand resting on the golden retriever's back as the dog growled softly. "Do you think it's—" Then she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't have to ask who she meant. The visions had hinted at something, forces, entities, perhaps memories themselves that sought to sever their bond. He didn't know what they were or why they existed, but he knew they were dangerous. Before he could respond, the front door swung open with a deafening crash, the wind howling through the room like a living thing. Ethan shielded Zara as best he could, his heart racing as the fire in the hearth sputtered and nearly went out. The dogs surged forward, their barking frantic as they formed a barrier between the open door and their humans. "What do you want?" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking but defiant. "Why are you doing this?" The answer came not in words but in a surge of energy that sent him staggering backward. The room seemed to shift, the walls blurring as the past and present collided. One moment he was in the cabin, and the next, he was on a windswept battlefield, his sword slick with blood. Zara was there too, standing just beyond his reach, her face pale and her hands outstretched, as if trying to pull him to safety. "Ethan," she cried, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't let go." But even as he reached for her, he felt the pull of something stronger, an unseen force dragging him back, tearing him away from her. It was the same in every vision, every memory. No matter how hard they fought, something always came between them. Not this time. Ethan planted his feet, his hands tightening around the poker as he forced himself to stay grounded in the present. The battlefield faded, the cabin returning to focus as he turned to Zara. She was kneeling on the floor, her arms wrapped around Luna as the golden retriever growled at the open door. "We're not letting them win," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging around them. He reached for Zara, pulling her to her feet. "We've been through this before, and we've always lost. But not this time. Not again." Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw the strength he had always known she possessed. "What do we do?" she asked. "We hold on," he said simply. "No matter what happens, we hold on." The storm outside roared louder, the wind tearing at the cabin as if trying to rip it apart. The dogs stood firm, their growls a steady, defiant chorus as Ethan and Zara held each other tightly. The air around them shimmered, and Ethan felt the pull of the visions again, trying to drag them into the past. But this time they didn't let go. Through sheer force of will, they stayed grounded in the present, their love a tether that refused to break. The storm began to subside, the cabin settling into an uneasy stillness. The dogs relaxed slightly, their growls fading into soft whines as the tension in the room lifted. Ethan exhaled, his grip on Zara loosening just enough for him to look into her eyes. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "We broke through." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she leaned into him. "This time we held on." As the fire crackled back to life and the dogs settled around them, Ethan and Zara knew that their love had been tested in ways they could never have imagined. And though the battle wasn't over, they had proven that their bond was stronger than any force that sought to tear them apart. They had chosen each other, and they would choose each other again and again, in this life and every one to come. The storm began with a whisper, a low rustling of wind through the towering pines surrounding the cabin. It built gradually, the gusts gaining strength, the forest bending and swaying as though something unseen was moving through it. Inside, the fire burned brightly, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill creeping into Ethan and Zara's hearts. The dogs, usually sprawled comfortably across the floor, were restless. Scout paced near the door, her paws clicking against the wood. Diesel stood alert by the window, his ears perked as if listening for a sound only he could hear. Ethan and Zara sat on the couch, their hands intertwined, their connection a lifeline in the growing tension. The visions had reached a breaking point over the past week, no longer fleeting glimpses, but immersive experiences that felt more real than the present. They had seen themselves in countless lives as lovers torn apart by war, as partners bound together by sacrifice, as strangers who met only to realize they had always known each other. "What do you think it means?" Zara asked softly, her green eyes searching Ethan's face. Her voice carried a note of fear, a tremor she tried to hide but couldn't fully suppress. Ethan looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I think it's trying to tell us something," he said, "something we've been missing." "But why now?" she pressed. "Why here? What's different about this place?" Before Ethan could answer, a low rumble of thunder rolled through the forest, vibrating the floor beneath their feet. Scout let out a sharp bark, her tail stiff as she turned toward the door. Luna, ever the most sensitive of the pack, whined softly and pressed against Zara's leg, her golden fur warm and comforting. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But whatever it is, I think we're supposed to face it together." The storm outside intensified, the wind howling as rain began to lash against the windows. The dogs gathered closer, their presence a protective circle around Ethan and Zara. The fire flickered, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls, and for a moment the cabin felt like it was teetering on the edge of two worlds, the present and the past, the real and the unseen. It began with a sudden flash of light, not from the storm but from within the room itself. The air shimmered, rippling like heat waves, and Ethan felt a strange pull deep in his chest, as though something ancient and powerful was stirring inside him. Zara gasped, her grip on his hand tightening as the light coalesced in the center of the room, forming a swirling golden thread that seemed to pulse with life. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see that?" "I do," he said, his own voice thick with awe. "What is it?" The thread seemed to respond to their voices, stretching and weaving itself into a shape and intricate pattern that glowed brighter with each passing second. It was beautiful and haunting, its movements fluid and purposeful, as though it carried a message neither of them could yet decipher. Zara reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the thread. The moment she made contact, the room shifted. The fire vanished, the storm outside silenced, and they were no longer in the cabin. Instead, they stood in a vast, endless space filled with shimmering light. It wasn't cold or warm, dark or bright, it simply was, a place beyond time and space. "Where are we?" Zara asked, her voice echoing softly. "I don't know," Ethan said, taking a cautious step forward. The golden thread hovered before them, its glow steady and inviting. "But I think we're meant to follow it." As they moved closer, the thread expanded, unraveling into a tapestry that stretched out before them. Images appeared within its glowing fibers, scenes from their past lives woven together in intricate detail. Ethan saw himself as a warrior, his sword raised in defiance as Zara tended to the wounded behind him. He saw her as a scholar, poring over ancient texts while he stood guard at her side. He saw them as farmers, as travelers, as strangers who met by chance in bustling marketplaces or lonely roads, always drawn to each other as if by an invisible force. "It's you," Zara said, her voice filled with wonder. "All of our lives, all the times we've found each other." Ethan nodded, his chest tight as he took it all in. "It's like we're connected, like we've always been connected." The thread pulsed again, and the images shifted, showing not just their moments of triumph and joy, but also their moments of loss. Ethan saw himself holding Zara as she took her last breath, his tears falling onto her lifeless body. He saw her standing on a windswept cliff, staring out at the sea with an expression of despair as he vanished into the horizon. He saw the battles, the separations, the sacrifices that had defined their love across centuries. "Why does it always end like this?" Zara asked, her voice breaking. "Why do we always lose each other?" "I don't know," Ethan said, his throat tight. "But I think that's why we're here, to figure out why. To finally change it." The thread shifted again, its glow intensifying as a new image appeared. This time it was the cabin, the present. Ethan and Zara saw themselves sitting by the fire, their hands intertwined, their dogs gathered around them. But there was something different about the scene. The golden thread was there too, weaving itself around them, binding them together in a way that seemed unbreakable. "It's telling us something," Zara said, her eyes fixed on the image. "That this is the moment. This is the life where we change the pattern." Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll do it," he said. "No more running. No more losing each other. This time we fight." The light around them began to dim, the shimmering space dissolving as they were pulled back to the cabin. The fire roared to life once more, the storm outside raging with renewed intensity. But something was different now. The air felt charged, alive with possibility, as though the very fabric of the universe had shifted. Ethan and Zara looked at each other, the golden thread still faintly visible around them, its glow a quiet but steady reminder of their bond. The dogs pressed closer, their warm bodies a grounding presence, their eyes filled with an understanding that seemed far beyond the scope of any ordinary animal. "We can't let go," Zara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "No matter what happens, we hold on to this. To us. We will," Ethan said, pulling her into his arms. "We've fought for this love across lifetimes. We're not losing it now." As they held each other, the golden thread pulsed gently, its light weaving around them and the dogs, binding them all together. It was a reminder of their eternal connection, a testament to the love and sacrifice that had defined their journey through time. And though the storm outside continued to rage, inside the cabin, they felt a quiet certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. Their love was no longer bound by time or space. It was a thread that connected them across worlds, unbroken and eternal. And in that moment, they knew that no force, no matter how powerful, could ever sever the bond they shared. The storm had passed, leaving the forest quiet and serene. Early morning light filtered through the trees, casting golden rays onto the cabin's porch where Ethan and Zara sat together. A steaming cup of coffee rested in Ethan's hands, its warmth seeping into his palms as he stared out at the dew-covered landscape. Beside him, Zara leaned against his shoulder, her fingers lightly intertwined with his. The air between them was calm, but it carried a weight of shared understanding that their lives had shifted irrevocably. The golden thread they had seen the night before still lingered faintly in their minds, its light imprinted like an afterimage on their souls. They hadn't spoken much since returning to the cabin, the enormity of what they had experienced leaving them both introspective. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was a shared space where their thoughts and emotions mingled without the need for words. "You feel it, don't you?" Zara asked softly, her voice breaking the stillness. Her green eyes, vivid and bright in the morning sun, turned to meet his. Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Yeah. It's like everything makes sense now, all the visions, the memories, even the dogs acting the way they have. It's all connected." Zara smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around his. "We've been through so much, Ethan. So many lives, so many losses. But this time it feels different." "It is," Ethan said firmly, his tone resolute. "We're not just living in the echoes of the past anymore. This time we get to choose what happens next." The dogs lounged nearby, their presence a steady comfort. Scout lay at the edge of the porch, her head resting on her paws as her sharp eyes scanned the forest. Luna was curled up beside Zara, her golden fur glowing in the sunlight. Diesel stretched lazily in the grass, letting out a satisfied sigh as Rocky and the others wandered the yard. It was a peaceful scene, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the peace they had found was hard-won and fragile. Zara reached for her coffee, taking a sip before setting the mug back on the wooden railing. "Do you think we can really break the cycle?" she asked, her voice tinged with quiet hope. "After everything we've been through, do you think we can finally have a life that's—" Ethan turned to her, his expression soft but unwavering. "I think we already have," he said. "Whatever happens next, it's not about running from the past anymore. It's about building something new, something better." Her smile grew, the tension in her shoulders easing as his words settled over her like a balm. "You always know what to say," she murmured, leaning closer to him. "How do you do that?" He chuckled, his arms slipping around her waist. "Years of practice," he said teasingly. "Lifetime after lifetime of figuring out what makes you smile." She laughed, the sound light and musical, and for a moment the weight of their shared history lifted. Ethan held her closer, his lips brushing against her temple as he whispered, "We've got this, Zara. Together." The day unfolded gently, each moment filled with a quiet intimacy that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. They spent hours walking through the forest. Their hands clasped as they explored paths Scout seemed to lead them down with purpose. Ethan pointed out small signs of wildlife, while Zara collected wildflowers, tucking them into her pockets with a soft smile. The dogs darted in and out of the trees, their joyful energy a reminder of the simple beauty in the present. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan and Zara sat by the fire pit outside the cabin. The flames crackled softly, sending embers spiraling into the twilight. Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, his thoughts wandering as he watched the flickering light. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the companionable silence, "about what we saw last night, about what it all means." Zara looked up from where she was braiding a strand of wildflowers into a crown. "What about it?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just showing us our past, Zara. It was showing us what we're capable of. Every life we've lived, every time we found each other, it's all been leading to this. To us finally being able to break free." She tilted her head, her eyes softening. "Break free from what?" "From the pain," he said quietly. "From the pattern that's kept us stuck. I think we've been given this chance to make things right, to finally live without the weight of everything that came before." Zara's fingers stilled, the flower crown resting in her lap. "Do you really think that's possible? That we can just let go of all of it?" "I think it's the only way forward," he said, his voice steady. "We'll never forget what we've been through, but we can choose not to let it define us anymore. We can choose to be happy." Tears welled in her eyes and she reached for his hand, her touch trembling but firm. "I want that," she said. "I want it more than anything." "Then we'll make it happen," he promised, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "No matter what it takes." The dogs, as if sensing the shift in their resolve, moved closer, forming a protective circle around the fire. Scout sat at Ethan's feet, her gaze steady and knowing, while Luna rested her head on Zara's lap. Diesel stood watch a few feet away, his ears perked and alert, his presence grounding them both. As the stars began to appear overhead, Zara leaned against Ethan's shoulder, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready for it. As long as I have you." "You always will," Ethan said, his lips brushing against her hair. in this life and every one after. The night deepened, the fire burning low as they sat together, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the steadfast presence of their dogs. They didn't need words to fill the silence. Their connection spoke volumes on its own. The golden thread of their bond, though invisible now, was stronger than ever, binding them to a future they were ready to build together. And in that quiet, starlit moment, they knew they had already begun.